Shown on the slide is the orbit of a binary star system known by its Washington double star catalog designation 01398-5612. And this is the orbit of a secondary star around a primary star whose location is denoted by this cross in the lower center of the image. You'll notice that these points at the lower left were taken longer ago, and there seems to be more scatter in them. They're farther apart. And though the more recent ones up here also exhibit some amount of scatter. This orbit, like all binary star orbits, can be described by 7 parameters. And the first 4 are somewhat familiar. The semi-major axis is analogous to the radius of the circle, so it controls how big the ellipse is. E is the eccentricity of the orbit. For a perfectly circular orbit, E would be 0, and then as it gets closer to 1, the orbit becomes more elongated and oval-looking. I is the inclination of the orbit relative to our plane of sight. So even a perfectly circular orbit would look oval if it were inclined relative to our plane of sight. And I is the parameter that describes how inclined it is. And P is the orbital period, how long the secondary takes to complete one full circuit of the primary. These last 3 parameters, the Greek letter ones, are somewhat mysterious, but we'll explore those a little more using Desmos. To do this, go to desmos.com and click Start Graphing. It's an online graphing calculator, so if you type an equation like this equation for an ellipse in the upper left box, you'll see an ellipse get drawn. You can also plot data. So go to tiny.cc/orbit3d_data, and then copy paste cells R2 to S51 into a new line in the Desmos window in the upper left, and it will plot those data points. And you can get rid of the ellipse you originally drew by clicking the X next to that equation, and then you can pan and zoom in the window to see the data set. These are selected points from this data set for the orbit of our friend 01398-5612. So you can see how they look in Desmos. But that's not all you can do. Hagen Hensley wrote this amazing orbit solver in which you can actually move the ellipse parameters and see the position of the expected data points relative to the actual positions of the data points. So the black dots are the data points, and the green dots are the data points as they would be expected, where they would be expected to fall based on the current ellipse parameter values. And so the distance between the observed data points and their expected position are the residuals. That's what we want to minimize to solve the orbit. Right now, you can see that this starts out very far off from the expected orbit, but we can adjust those parameters and minimize the residuals all visually. Some people find it easier to X out the green dots just to make it easier to see what's going on, and Desmos makes that really easy. You can just click the X next to the green dots and they're gone. And we can get some more reasonable values for the parameters by looking at the generated sample data from which he made this plot. So for example, if you look at that sample data, you'll see that time appears to go from the early 1800s to the early, to 2013 or 2016-ish. So, and the data appears to cover about 2/3 to 3/4 of an orbit in that time. It goes around about 3/4 of the way. So the orbital period's probably close to 300 years-ish. And you can also see that theta m is the other time-dependent parameter. Sliding that back and forth changes the residuals mightily, but doesn't change the expected shape of the graph at all. So that's dependent on time. You can also start building intuition for all of the other parameters that seem mysterious, and this was hugely helpful to me in understanding them. These are the best fit parameters that I came up with. You can see we get an r squared close to 1, which symbolizes a pretty good fit, and Desmos calculates that automatically as you're sliding things around and playing with them there. You can also start from scratch. Here's another one that starts with all of the parameters being 0, and I found it useful to adjust them one by one. So you'll notice that lowercase omega doesn't have any effect until you have a non-zero eccentricity. And that starts giving you a clue as to what lowercase omega is. It's called the argument of periapsis, which is the angle that the secondary makes with the primary at its point of closest approach as projected onto the orbital plane. So by sliding that back and forth, you can start realizing what that means. At first, there are no residuals plotted on the graph, and that's because there's no period for this orbit. But we can estimate the period again from the sample data. And here's the sample data. Now it appears to go like 4/5-ish of the way around in the 180 years. And you can imagine it'll be a lot harder to guess the period if your arc is shorter, because we know from Kepler's second law that it's going at different speeds over the course of its orbit. So you really need a sizable chunk of the orbit before you can get a reasonable estimate of P from the sample data. A lot of math went into this, and you can see it. It's all there if you click the down arrow next to the functions folder. And it's complicated, and I don't pretend to understand it. Hagen wrote it all. You'll notice he also made this data realistic. The residuals, this amount of scatter is smaller in later data points. These are the later data points at the bottom of this graph. And you'll notice that you can get a similar goodness of fit by varying capital omega by pi. And I was still really fuzzy on what capital omega really did, and I was musing that it might be easier to see this in if only we could see the orbit in 3 dimensions. So he responded with this. And if you click this link, you'll see a 3-dimensional view. And not only is it 3-dimensional, you can change your perspective by changing the sliders at the top to see this from different angles. The actual orbit of the secondary is in red, and its projection onto our plane of sight is purple. And this capital omega is actually the angle at which the actual orbit and the projected orbit intersect when the secondary is going up. It's called longitude of the ascending node. And this blue line is the line of nodes. It's where those two planes intersect. And so by sliding it around in 3D really helped me to get a better sense for what exactly that parameter was. You can also get a better sense for what lowercase omega really is, and group these spatial parameters into kind of 2 categories, where the semi-major axis and the eccentricity and this angle of periapsis determine what that orbit, the shape of the orbit on the red plane, the orbital plane, and they're measured with respect to the orbital plane. Well, the lowercase omega is with respect to celestial north as projected onto the orbital plane. And then these other 2, inclination and uppercase omega, determine how that orbit is tilted relative to the plane of our sight. So that I found to be amazingly helpful. There's so much tricky math in this. The first equation, I don't pretend to understand any of it. The first equation is on the way to calculating uppercase omega. And it's just sort of an intermediate in the calculation. This is how you do recursion in Desmos. I think it's a couple layers in. And then the second one is to help render it in 3 dimensions. So that is way too small to see, and if you could see it, it wouldn't be any more comprehensible. At least it's not to me. This can be done with real data. That's the most exciting thing of all. So if you get your actual data, as from our friend 01398-5612, with time and then in Cartesian coordinates x and y in 3 columns like that, as they are at this link. You have to do 3 columns of cells, Q2 to S51. Highlight those and copy paste those into where the generated sample data are. So you delete what's there and put those in instead, and rename the column headers to tell Desmos that it's time X and Y. And you can see this real data plotted along with residuals and move the sliders to minimize those visually and manually. And you might have to do some tricks with the zoom to make that happen. But I could get to a pretty decent R-squared, 0.951. My sons, Ezra and Ryan, were able to get even better, though they weren't constrained by reality. For example, their eccentricity is negative, which is exciting. but this is really helpful. You can look at it from different angles. You can see how close you're getting, and you can see what changes what in a way that is hugely helpful to those of us who benefit from that kind of visual aid. This is helpful for solving orbits because it helps you get to a good best guess to feed into a gradient descent or other algorithm for further refinement. It's computationally extremely expensive to search a 7-dimensional parameter space and have it converge in any reasonable amount of time. So you need a good best guess to start with, and this can really help get there. But even more useful than that for my purposes is the way in which it helps students build an understanding of the parameter, me being the first student to have played with this. One thing that I realized doing this is that the projection is really what controls the goodness of fit. In fact, my son Ezra, when he was fitting the 3-dimensional thing that I showed on the last slide, just said, wait, this red doesn't really affect anything. I'm going to just get rid of it and work in 2 dimensions, because it was kind of easier for him to see how he was doing that way. But the red is really useful. The actual orbit is really useful to see what's really going on and understand what each of the parameters are doing. You also gain an appreciation for how very sensitive those best guess parameters are to scatter that's in the original data. This is 50 points from that data set, and had I chosen a different 50, I think the fit would have been very different. And you can also gain an appreciation for how easy it is to get trapped in local minima, because sometimes you have to change one parameter and make it worse, and then change another parameter and make it better. It's not something where you can just vary each parameter individually. So that was enormously helpful for me. I think it will be enormously helpful for my students, and I'm excited to share it with all of you. Thank you.